We are live.
This is
yeah. Tell it's been a while.
It's Michael. Yeah, it's Michael.
I'm sorry.
Hit it, Michael.
You were right.
This is Literary Roadhouse, one short story once a week. I'm Michael.
I'm Anise.
And I'm Maya. And today we are joined by Michael Aron. Listeners may remember him on past show. I think it's been a couple years since you've been on the show. He's an author of over 40 science fiction and fantasy books, including Asteroid X series, Modern Necromancy series, and the Galaxy Maverick series. He writes from the Great Plains of Iowa and has perfected the art of balancing writing with a full-time job and family, writing 5 to 7 books a year. You can find him at www.michaelaron.com. The link will be provided in the show notes. Welcome back, Michael. It's good to see you.
Guys. Thanks, guys. It's awesome to be back and hanging out with the gang again.
Yeah, I'm really excited to discuss this fairy tale. As we were saying in the pre-show, I really need your guidance here because my notes are very short. So.
We don't have a great track record for analyzing short stories. It tends to go along the lines of, what more is there? But I do think maybe you will save us from this track record, Michael.
I accept that as a challenge. Is that a challenge? Maybe
it is a challenge.
Okay, so I want to know down to the minute and second how long the average fairy tale episode goes. So
that would be an interesting.
So we can beat that average.
So, just top level, how did everybody feel about this story?
Well, I don't even know. It felt fine. I don't even know how
You're
I feel.
So funny. Anyways.
I know. My biggest note is, let me see. The biggest takeaway that I have here is that this is a story that is felt rather than reasoned. So I felt like I didn't think a lot, but I felt a lot. So that was fine. And there was a little slight emotional roller coaster, but it was never huge because it's still a children's story. But it made me feel what I was supposed to feel when I wanted to feel it. And, the sad old maid who didn't get to marry the sailor and all like that. Yeah. For people who didn't read the story, just real quick, a summary. So it's a story told from the perspective of a broken bottleneck that's being used to hold drinking water for an old woman's pet canary. And the bottleneck thinks back on its really kind of remarkable life, which is connected to a portrait painter's son and a farmer's daughter who become engaged. And it's like the wine bottle's best memory ever, who he keeps referring back to this memory of like, oh my God, they were such a great couple. She was so great. And then after the engagement, the wine bottle is discarded, found, repurposed as a homemade medicine for a sailor who is the betrothed. Then the ship goes down. He puts a message. The sailor puts a message in the bottle for his loved one. She never gets it. The bottle winds up in a foreign country. They can't read the note. He gets shipped with wine to his home country. It's like a whole thing. He goes up in a hot air balloon. He's thrown out. It's madness. Until finally, he's repurposed as... Also, this is the part I love. It says some random dudes are like, that broken bottle there would be great for giving a bird water. There's this old maid in town who has a pet bird. But it's great because it's a fairy tale, so it doesn't matter, right? So they bring this... So this whole time, this broken bottleneck's thinking about how sad it is, and he wishes he could see this farmer girl again, not knowing that the old maid is the farmer girl. And the farmer girl, it's just like coincidences everywhere, right? If there's a theme here, it's like fate. And then, but the old maid doesn't realize this is like a keepsake from the day that she was engaged either. Neither one of them have any idea of who the other is.
It's funny. I actually like fairy tales. I used to collect them. Hans Christian Andersen, I enjoy his fairy tales mainly because I like the language, but he's not my favorite. I'm definitely more of a Grimm's girl. I like my fairy tales down and dirty with lots of blood and horrible things for children. They just feel a little bit more adult. I feel like this story was very clean, very lovely, beautiful, but I felt like there could have been more there. And I do tend to feel that whenever I get the sense, like, this is like hero's journey, but I mean, he's a bottle, so he doesn't have any real emotional growth. The way he changes is by being broken. And so, I mean, that's really where I hiccup, but at the same time, like, I enjoyed this a great deal. It just isn't my favorite fairy tale. How about for you, Michael?
Yes, I've being super quiet, listening to all the comments.
He's
here.
grinning over there.
So the reason I picked this story is because I read this story, I don't know, years ago. And when I read it, I just remember, like you said, Anna, just emotionally responding to it. And I remember not thinking a whole lot throughout the story either, but it was after the story when I started really thinking about what had happened and just everything that the bottleneck had been through and how well Christian Andersen characterizes this inanimate object that, you know, gets almost, if not more, just as much treatment as a human. And I just remember being blown away by that and remembering, wow, I mean, this guy can take an inanimate object like a bottleneck, you know, and it's not like an animal or, you know, a cartoon character or anything, but it's an inanimate object, and he gave it a soul. He gave it a spirit. He gave it, you know, emotions, and you really feel for this bottleneck at the end of the story. And just that final line of the bottleneck, you know, I could see him in like such a pensive gaze, while the maid is also in a pensive gaze looking out the window, and it's like both of them suffering together. And there's just something so impressionistic about it. It just, the whole thing reminded me of like an impressionist painting, just the language and the colors and the sights and the sounds and the smells. And I'm attracted to those sorts of things. And I think that me as an author, I love to write stories about characters that are unorthodox.
Yeah.
So I've written stories about teddy bears. You know, I've given them spirits. I've written
broccoli.
Yeah, broccoli. I've written the story with, you know, vegetables, it turned them into characters. And so this was one of those stories that really just flicked a light bulb on for me in the back of my head.
Oh, yeah. As I was reading it, I could tell right away that this story would have just gotten you, you know? Yeah. And honestly, I think that's Hans Christian Andersen's strength is Grimm's fairy tales. I feel like their plots are more interesting and there's just so much cool stuff going on. The Hans Christian Andersen is way better with the characterizations.
Yeah,
his characters are so solid, and so this is a bottle. He doesn't have an emotional growth, but he's a bottle. He couldn't like his growth is physical, which makes sense because his character isn't being anthropomorphized. This is not a bottle as human. This is a bottle as bottle. It just happens to have a personality. But I think the personality that Christensen gave him is definitely works for the fact that he's not human.
I would say he actually does have growth. You know, I mean, the story itself is a story of the bottle's entire life, right? So it's the bottle going through life. And I think that the growth, you see it in the beginning of the story. You know, it's him at his height. And then I think it's the stunted growth at the end that he never gets over, which I think humanizes him even more. And it's more of a growth for the reader reading it.
See, I don't see him as growing. I see the bottle as very selfish and self-absorbed. He's so into this past experience that he had that he can't look outside himself.
Right.
And see what's happening around him and appreciate what's happening around him because he's constantly referencing before. And you could call this a fall from grace story. You know, if we want to talk about... It's almost
like reverse growth, right?
Yeah.
So he starts off at the top and then deteriorates as the story goes along.
Yeah. I mean, if we're going to categorize it in story form, I think that's the closest. Poor Anais is sitting there like, these two, I'm just going to wind him up and let him go.
Where are we at on the clock here?
I mean, it's funny. I have one actual discussion point to bring up based on what you guys were just saying. And then another is just a tangent that I keep thinking about that has nothing to do with anything. But the one point that you guys were saying where it's that he's selfish and self-absorbed. So the version that we all read, the link, the gilead.org link that I linked to in Slack, that translation, I found another one from the Andersen Institute, like the website that has his collections as well. And the translation is just different enough that in the Andersen one, what you were saying about him being selfish comes through much more. Because at the end of so at the end of the one that I linked, it's like that the bottle didn't recognize the old maid, perhaps because he was thinking so much about her is the one we read. And in the other translation, it's because he was thinking so much about himself, which I thought was interesting. And that's the version that the Andersen Institute posts on their website.
Which makes sense because, I mean, when you read classic fairy tales, usually the moral is pretty blunt. And so, I mean, we've talked about before how translations change things. These were translated from German?
Danish.
Danish. Okay. Yeah. So that totally makes sense. One thing that I have a question for you, Annie, since you, seem kind of ambivalent about this story. We've read parables in the past. I think we've read a couple fairy tales, not very much. We've read more parables because, well, Grammy. In the stream of these types of stories, where do you think it falls as far as complexity? Because to me, I feel like this is a much more complex story of this type that we've read so far.
Yeah, it is, but it's still intended for children, and that comes through in the lessons and what you're supposed to take out of it, which is fine. So it's like the story structure itself, all the different plot points. There's a lot of ups and downs, which reminds me of something that we shared on the Literary Roadhouse page on Facebook that was about like the emotional cycle of a protagonist, and Hans Christian Andersen came up in that because The Ugly Duckling has like more ups and downs than like Pride and Prejudice. Like in like a very small amount of space, he's like putting you on a roller coaster. And this story does that too. There's a lot of ups and downs, but for all that complexity, you're not getting more. You're not getting that much more insight into whatever the theme is or whatever it is that he's ruminating on, in the way that you would in a different, going back to the Pride and Prejudice example, as an adult, we're getting out of that a lot more, even if it's not as much of a roller coaster. So I think, not that it's not a roller coaster, it is, but you know what I'm saying? Like, this is like literally like roiling. So it's just, it is more complex. And the idea of having a talking bottleneck is sort of interesting. It has a fantastical element that's more attractive to children usually, but also there's plenty of adults who love fantasy and sci-fi. But it's just, I always go back to that as an adult reader, why? The question of why. And the why here is very simplistic because it's for kids.
See, I don't necessarily always consider fairy tales for children, just because fairy tales originally were a verbal art form that would be told to each other. And many of our greatest fairy tales, in their original form, most adults would not read to children, like ever. And so when I think of fairy tales, I think of them as lessons and that aren't as simplistic as a parable. I feel like parables often are more simplistic. And so I do think that this has a really strong why. And I don't necessarily think it's for children. I think that this story has a really good lesson about opening your eyes and looking outside yourself and appreciating your life at various moments for what it is. He's so oblivious. He doesn't recognize that the woman is the woman that he's been thinking about, or that the man is the sailor that he'd been thinking about, I don't know how I feel about it. It's not my favorite fairy tale, but I do think it was very well written. And I like it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I that's like I said, I love the writing style of this, and for me, I don't know that it's necessarily for children. I don't know how Hans Christian Andersen felt about his stories and whether he wrote them specifically for children. I remember reading like a biographic article somewhere that said something to the tune that he wasn't always writing for children. I don't think. I think there's a lesson that you can take from this outside of opening your eyes, and that's that suffering is real, and that what's that story, be kind, or the quote, be kind to everyone you meet, for they're fighting a great battle. You know, that's the one quote that I guess always remember. You know, when I read this story, you can look at someone and never know what they're going through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Though I would say it's true that Hans Christian Andersen did not, but when they say that he didn't only write for children, it's also because, again, I was on the like Institute website for a while. He also wrote like travel type stuff, like travel memoirs and travel logs and plays and poems and novellas and a whole bunch of other stuff aside from the fairy tale, which they classified as separate. And I think the fairy tales here was happening at a time when, well, in the centuries, it was a lot of centuries where a lot of different European countries were sort of churning out their own fairy tales. And some of them, no unknown authors, it was an oral tradition. And some of them were deliberately written by one person in this style. Yeah. And I agree that it's not only for children in the sense that these fairy tales sort of have become so well known that they are sort of like the fabric of Western society's like values and morals and everything like that, which applies to adults as much as children. But that's something that you are trying to impart to children. And I feel like these stories are written in a way to be very easily digestible by them. As I was doing this research, apparently the original Little Mermaid, before it was Disneyfied, she's in purgatory, and when children misbehave, she's in purgatory for 1 year longer, and when children behave, she's in purgatory for 1 year shorter. Like very clearly manipulative to get kids to behave, right? So I think it's sort of like it applies to adults in that everyone has to follow these rules, and these lessons apply not only to children, but the way it's written, it's not really exploring adult themes or nuances in a way that a lot of other short stories we read on the show do. And I think that's what makes it a fairy tale.
For me, I classify, when I look at fairy tales, I look at the ones that are for children are normally written in a way where the child themselves can pick out the moral. And the ones written for adults can be read to children, but I feel like the ones written for adults, the moral would have to be explained to a child. I don't think they themselves can pick it out. And in this story, I don't necessarily think a child could pick it out, because the idea of, getting old and looking at your life and being too self-absorbed by that, I don't think that's necessarily something a child can understand. I think that is something that you would have to read to a child and explain to them what the moral is. Whereas, like you said, The Little Mermaid, very blatant explanation of what the moral is. And a lot of those fairy tales are like that. That said, Grimm's fairy tales often didn't do that, but the moral was still really, really obvious.
Yeah, because it scares the heck out of the kids.
Yeah.
Like Hansel and Gretel, or, all the...
Yeah, the ones for adults, I feel like they're more subtle.
That's a good point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in this story in particular, I think also, as I was saying before, there's different translations. The translation that you read makes it more or less obvious. So I just found the other one. So the very last line is, "The old bottle didn't know her either, for it hadn't listened to what she had said, partly, in fact, chiefly, because it thought only of itself." Thesis statement right at the end, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And that's one thing where, I think it's really fascinating how translations can change how we read a story. Michael, maybe 5 months ago, we read a short story that had won a translation award, where they give an award to both the writer of the story and the translator of a story. And it awards excellency in translations. I thought that was really fascinating. Because so many people can translate the same thing and end up, so separate, and it's an art in and of itself for sure.
Yeah, there's some languages that don't translate easily, so like,
or arguably at all.
or at all. Yeah, exactly. And I don't know what it is about like Danish. It seems like it translates really well into English. I've read some translations in the past. I won't say which languages, but just doesn't feel like it's like, doesn't matter what translator you read or what version you read. It's just really hard to get into. I don't know why.
I also think translations from languages that are more Germanic in nature. I feel like, you know, when you look at the English language, we have our Germanic words, and then we have our like Frenchified, what do they call it? Renaissance, Latinate based words.
Yeah.
And I feel like the ones that are translating from more Germanic languages, I think maybe because our Germanic words in English tend to be really simple and straight to the point words, maybe that's why they translate easier. But some of the translations from Asian languages are horrid.
Yeah. Sometimes,
it
yeah,
does not
depends on
translate well.
Yeah, it just depends on the translator too, because it's tough because sometimes you have to take some liberties with
you
what you're
have
writing,
to, and there's so much nuance in you know, some of the Asian languages. There's so much nuance, and they look at things completely differently. You know, a lot of the language is. I once dated someone who was studying linguistics, and he was talking about how language affects how we think and affects the sciences that develop in a culture. So if you have a language that's really at its core about dissecting and labeling and taking apart to find minute pieces, like our language, most Western languages, then you're going to develop things like modern medicine, where you're trying to find the cause and you're getting down to core minute things. Whereas if you have a language that's more holistic, that's looking for the commonalities, then your sciences are going to be very different. It's like almost the flip side. And I wonder how much that affects the ability to translate.
Yeah. And two, like sentence structure, you know, where adjectives go and all of that sometimes can have a huge impact on, you know, the story. And just sometimes, like what I like to see in translations is I like to see some sort of, I don't know, semblance of what people liked in the original version. So
yes.
And I feel like sometimes the flowery language and the imagery usually gets lost. And for me, you've got to have that with the translation. Otherwise, you know, people read for story, but I don't know. I just like to be able to see what I'm seeing, you know, when I'm reading.
Yeah.
And if I can't see that in a translation, it makes it really easy for me to check out.
Yeah, one area where you really notice that is poetry. So if you're translating a poem where the original author is very sparse with their language, your translation can't end up being all flowery, you know, and vice versa. And it's really obvious because you're also dealing with meter and rhythm. And I've run into I've read a couple different translations of Pablo Neruda, and you can definitely tell which translators are using the rhythm patterns that Neruda would have used in the original language, and which translators are just, you know, being very by the numbers. These are the words used. This is the sentence, you know, and typically the ones that are more artistic, that follow the rhythm, tend to be much more enjoyable to read.
Yeah, it's scary when you start thinking about translations and, you know, the fact that AIs may potentially be doing them in the future. You think about that. It's like, man,
you're going to open up a can of worms, and then you're going to win that bet you gave us. I see what you did there. You're like, yeah, I'm going to win this longest fairy tale episode. I'm going to bring up AI, get them going. I see.
Hey, you guys challenged me in the beginning. Like Marty McFly in Back to the Future. I'm not going to be called a chicken.
So when you're looking at a fairy tale and you're dissecting it as literature, you know, I do like to look at some of the same things, but it seems so difficult because usually those things are very, very easy to pick out. Like, what's the theme? Easy enough. You know, how's the language? Easy enough to figure out. How, you know, that's where I really struggle picking out the complexities. Did you find any shadow meanings or other symbolism used in the story that maybe I overlooked because I was too busy being a 5-year-old listening to a story?
No, and not because I couldn't find them. I think it was because I never looked for them. The more I read and the more I'm further out of school, the less I read about shadow meanings and things like that, unless it really jumps out at me. I'm sure that if you were to look at this story, they would be there. You know, one of the things that I like about fairy tales, particularly of the Hans Christian Andersen variety and of the Grimm variety too, is that they're kind of like snapshots.
Yeah.
Like almost like little photographs. I mean, he does more with this character, and I think it's like 1,500 words than, you know, in stories that are 4 or 5 times longer. And so it's like this highly condensed, very colorful, almost like a Thomas Kincaid painting, you know. And I really like that. And so when I'm looking at my fairy tales and I'm reading those, I care far more about just the experience of going through it, just enjoying the experience for what it is.
But yet we do get a sense of color, a sense of mood, even in that 1,500 words. So I want to ask you, you know, Anise, when you read this story, what color palette, or did you have a color palette or a vision that came to mind as you're reading the story? I'm curious how similar or dissimilar our just impressions are.
Mm-hmm. It was very bright. But yeah, just like everything was very sort of, because it feels so fairy tale like, it almost feels like sort of animated, but not in a cheesy way, not like caricatures.
No.
But
but
or maybe because of the way that I was raised, I sort of associate Disney and fairy tales, since they took so many of them for their movies. It's almost like that, like kind of bright colors, and you know, everything, like all the characters are like pure hearted. There's no one with like a dark part of their heart other than like sadness, but no one there is like there like I mean, there can be. It's very black.
You could argue the balloonist is kind of the bad guy in this story, right?
What?
The balloonist.
He's kind
of the bad guy in the story, but yeah.
He threw a bunny out of a hot air balloon and then a wine bottle for no reason, which it's just reckless. As soon as he did that, I'm like, that can hit someone on the head. What are you doing? That's littering. That is dangerous. But he was sort of the worst one. But you know, at the same time, it's like, ooh, this wine bottle is so important because it flew. You know, like it just, there was something very sort of colorful about it, and which I think just added to my. It's like I enjoyed it, but I wouldn't like scream from the hilltops at all. Like I don't even know if I necessarily recommend this to like peers unless they specifically ask me for something like this. So like, for the genre, I'd be like, this is a good one. You should probably read this one. But just as a random recommendation, probably not, right? That's kind of where it exists.
Yeah.
Michael, what color palette were you seeing?
Color palette wise, this to me would be a watercolor painting. I would see some strong reds, strong blues, purples, maybe some oranges. That's kind of what I saw, you know, reading it.
And for me,
but go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, for me, it was definitely old Miyazaki, muted, bright but muted, if that makes any sense. So lots of it, but not like bright. No, not Spirited Away. Before that, Nausicaa, yellows, blues, muted, kind of watercolory. Annie's probably never saw Nausicaa. It's definitely a Miyazaki movie that, you know, Miyazaki lovers love, but he wasn't big yet in the US. And so a lot of people that are like, oh, Spirited Away or Princess Mononoke haven't never seen it. But it was beautiful, and it kind of was like Matisse. You know, the yellows and the blues and muted purples, those kinds of colors. One thing that stood out to me as you were talking, Annie's, was you were saying the balloonist would have been a villain. You know, all stories have to have a villain, but the villain's always introduced in like first third of the story. So I wouldn't actually say that he is the antagonist in the story. I would say fate and the passage of time is the antagonist in the story, because to me that's what's keeping him from his goal of going back. You know, he's constantly getting washed through. And as I'm saying that, water is a definite symbol in this. I mean, obviously he's a bottle, so he's made to contain liquids. When he's at his high point, he's holding wine. And throughout the story, he gets lower and lower, you know, and he's carrying different liquids, but also he's getting lower physically. He's dropped. He's getting drunk out of by a bird, whereas before he would have been poured into a glass. I'm grasping, but it's something.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think Michael.
It's a vague thought that I'm having. I feel like there's something there, and I can't quite pick it out.
Well, it's almost like he when he's created, he's meant to contain liquid, right? And the biggest problems that he has is
water.
Well, yeah, on the ocean, right? So like he's supposed to. I'm grasping here too.
We're all grasping because he was also in a dusty loft for a while. So
and that's when he essentially was emotionally dying, and he didn't get to learn any language because he was shut away. But he's being washed away. He's being washed through the shore. He's being drunk out of by an animal. He's being dropped from a balloon to the ground. I feel like there's symbolism there, and I just haven't been to school long enough to pick it out.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think Michael and I were being a little bit glib when we said the hot air balloon guy was.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean,
obviously.
Oh, I know.
No.
That's like the bad guy in those 80s TV shows where, you kick the puppy.
Oh, yeah. He's twisting his little mustache. Yeah, I know you were being glib, but it was funny because when you said that, it dawned on me that I hadn't really considered who the antagonist was. And I know that the story wouldn't have held my interest if there hadn't been one. So then I start racking my brain trying to figure out where the conflict was coming from and what that conflict is. And
I think the idea of fate is a good one, just because I kept doing a little bit more research, because when you have someone like Hans Christian Andersen who's so prolific, then you're like, okay, well, what are the common threads here? And so what I found was that a lot of times people suspect that the protagonists were him in different ways, even if it was a bottleneck, because he always had sort of downtrodden protagonists, sometimes with a happy ending, sometimes not with a happy ending. He would sort of go both ways, but they were usually lonely. He was a bachelor. He never married. And apparently this is just some fun trivia. The woman who he had his longest affair with still insisted on calling him brother, which is just weird. Okay.
That's a little strange. Maybe it's a language thing.
I make no judgment.
You're being friend zoned. How? But he made
them happy.
He was also apparently very vain. Of celebrities from that time, he has like the most photographs. He took a lot of like self-portraits, and he sent one to a friend of his. He was just like, I look really like, basically, I'm doing in the 2018 version, but his letter was basically, I'm so hot in this picture, people are going to wonder why I never married. Like, that was his letter. Which is funny. If you look up
what's funny is I'm picturing a selfie back then with the big, huge, large format cameras, and it's like you're like trying to take a picture and hold still for 5-10 minutes.
Hundreds of pictures of himself, hundreds. And he was raised really, really poor, like farmer type stuff. So a lot of the like poverty settings are from his personal experience growing up. He like left the countryside to go to Copenhagen to make it, and he did. And in the bottleneck particularly, not only is this a brooding, sort of lonely, downtrodden protagonist like he has in a lot of his stories, but also this guy, remember when the broken bottle early on in the story is like, yes, poetry is for the youth. And he was a poet. He can't speak out loud, but he's writing poems in his little broken bottle head. I just thought it was really funny. Like, it's just like a little bit like when authors don't do a great job of hiding themselves.
Yeah.
Well, authors don't do a great job of hiding themselves. They can usually hide themselves from maybe 1 or 2 books, but if they've written enough books, you see all their issues. I mean, that's just normal. And I do think this is why I often feel like I like reading an author cold the first time and then learning more about them and reading multiples of their work. A lot of times there are authors that I just don't like right away. And the more I read the work and I can really pick out the themes, the more I enjoy them. But also sometimes I'll read it completely off, may not like it. And then I learn more about the author and it gives it a totally different feel to the story.
Yeah. Or in some cases you read stories by an author and then you learn about them and then you wish you hadn't read the story. Sometimes that's the...
I don't usually have that emotion, but I know some people that do, especially in the current state of political and social commentary, that's actually becoming a pretty heavy debate. Do we stop reading, stop watching, stop appreciating art because the maker was a horrid person.
Yeah,
You know?
I don't necessarily know that I feel that way, but just like some of the underpinnings and some of things like that, it makes you think differently of a story negatively. And I've had a few times where maybe I've been burned on that, and just really makes me think more deeply about the story and about the author and about the circumstances that led to that.
One of the things that I find fascinating. Okay, now we're totally off topic. There is a YouTube channel called Stripped Cover Lit, and currently, well, for the last year and a half, one of the booktubers has never read Harry Potter, and he's being forced to read it, and he's like 33 years old. And it's kind of hilarious. And he's doing a literary analysis of it as he's reading it. And this book that we read as kids, me, young adult, like I was early 20s when I read it, because, I'm old people. But most people read it when they were children, and they loved it. And he's picking out all these sexist and racist and ableist and this is and that's stuff. And I'm just like horrified. And I'm like, I can never read Harry Potter again because I don't want to ruin my view of it. Like, I loved it so much. I gave up hours of my children to finish those stories. It was my mommy break once a year, and now he's ruining it.
I think through this podcast, that question of what you're supposed to do with the work when you learn horrible things about the artist, through this podcast, I've sort of started to answer that question for myself, which is, this happened when we read The Village, Lovecraft.
Mm-hmm.
So, he was a xenophobe and racist and just
a man of his time.
But here's the thing. So the way that it's come down for me is, it's the work that I am reading specifically. What is the point, the intention, the lesson of that work? So if I'm reading his horror and there's just some xenophobia and they're incidental but not partial to like the lesson, the morals of the story and the things that he is trying to spread, it's still about tentacle monsters in outer space. I can still sort of enjoy that while knowing he is who he is. But when we read The Village, the whole point of The Village is America should be white. Like, that was the whole point of The Village.
I've emotionally blocked that story from my reading past.
Yeah, so it's a little bit like, no. Like, he's referring to Native Americans as savages and how it was so great that they all got slaughtered and Russians are the worst. Like, no. So I think you need to be aware of what the author is trying to do here. So it's a little bit like, since you mentioned the political stuff, like a lot of times an author that's brought up in political discourse is Ayn Rand, right? And when you're reading her work, it's like, the whole point of this, though, is for her like really like intense, horrible, objectivist, whatever, capitalism. So that's why you can be like, no. Like, your philosophy's crap right now in this thing that I am reading. And I think that's what we should be paying attention to.
See, for me, and this is something that I've been tossing around in my head in light of loving movies that now find out there was all kinds of horrible sexist stuff happening behind the scenes.
That's so much harder.
Actresses being physically and sexually abused on the set.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very hard. But as an author and as someone that recognizes that many of our greatest artists were horrible human beings, again, to me, it's the experience of that piece. So if I'm looking at a movie or a painting and I'm enjoying this movie or painting and I'm seeing themes in it that are pulling me in and I'm finding value in it, then I can appreciate that piece and hate the maker. And again, whereas I wouldn't necessarily say what is the point of the piece, I would say is what is negative about this person showing up in the art, and is it causing me to stop and start? Because many times you may be a horrible being, but you're a horrible being, and your writing may actually be the opposite. So you may have horrible sexist feelings and be writing a very feminist work. And so I don't necessarily I look at the artist and the artwork separately.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've had to develop this really weird ambivalence, when you're reading things or watching things, like especially with a lot of the Me Too movement, a lot of these famous actors, and it's just really, it's almost like you become desensitized to it in a way, and it's like you don't want to, but you just can't. Like if I read a book by somebody who I know is a horrible person, I find out after the fact, it's kind of like you, Maya. Like, did I enjoy the work for what it was? What is it that maybe I can just piece out and deal with and try to figure that out on my own? Or yeah, it's weird because there's no resolution to it, right? Like,
no,
it's a constant, like it's always there.
And it's also a huge can of worms, because social mores change over time. And if you were to take away from circulation all the books, movies, TV shows, everything that came from a morally objectionable individual, that is a huge censorship issue.
Yeah, it is.
And we would lose a large part of the Western canon, and I feel like it is becoming a roundabout form of censorship that isn't necessarily healthy, but it's passing muster because it's being done for morally upright reasons.
Well, I think we're in the early stages still of this sort of super mass, rapid, lightning fast telecommunication, the internet.
But when have you ever known Americans to pull back from something after we've gone off the cliff?
I guess what I'm trying to get at is that the solution to this problem might be in the platform that's sort of shining a light on this problem as well, which is, so right now we're still in the early stages where it's very knee-jerk and everything, but what my hope is, whenever I've had these conversations about social media, is that over time, and you're already seeing it with like the youngest generations, Generation Z and stuff, they're already learning how to see the work, talk about the artist at the same time, how to, like, they're just learning better how to navigate how we should have these conversations online. And I think that's a skill that we're going to have to develop as a society, so that you don't censor things. You don't say, don't look at this. You can look at it, and at the same time, immediately you Google and you learn all this other stuff, and you start to be able to have both things in your mind at the same time.
Yeah.
Well, Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, which works as long as the media is still available.
It should be, obviously.
A lot of it's being pulled. Go try to find the Cosby Show and watch it. And that's my concern, is when the art is no longer available to be seen because showing it becomes objectionable itself. So I remember when Mapplethorpe got into all kinds of deep doo-doo for photographs he had done, and they were art, but his personal life was also being used to hammer home how horrible his art was. So his art was very edgy, but it was very meaningful to a lot of people. But his personal life was very objectionable to a lot of people. And so there would be like protests and stuff at like museums that were holding, showings of his work. And I know that I've seen art books from the 70s that couldn't be published now. I know Amazon was censoring one of Anais Nin's books that was found later on. So the book was published, but you couldn't find it in the Amazon search like rankings and recommendations and stuff. It was being tamped down. And so it's just, the whole thing is very concerning because, it does seem like for some reason we're unable to separate the artist from the work, and we're unable to charge an artist and hate an artist and hold them personally accountable for their real life actions without also entangling their art or vilifying their art with the same brush.
Yeah, and I want to make 2 points. So the first one is like the Cosby Show, perfect example, right? So there were so many other people that made that show a reality. The actions of one person ruined all of the work and the art that other people on the show who were completely innocent had, there's like collateral too. And that's not fair, and as much as you can't defend Bill Cosby for what he did, I don't know that it's fair to pull it from the air because it affects the livelihood of other people and all the people that it worked on it,
There's no abuse in that show.
No, there's not.
The show's not about abuse.
No,
And
there's
without the
not.
Cosby Show, I wouldn't have gone to college.
Right. And so, but the problem is, like, you feel like a terrible person even saying that, to bring that up because, but here, the other second point I wanted to make was, we're talking about censorship. And I think if you look at the history of fairy tales, so Hans Christian Andersen, L. Frank Baum, the Arabian Nights, Grimm fairy tales, this conversation comes up again and again is, do you censor fairy tales? Should children be able to read something like Grimm, right? And so then you have L. Frank Baum, who was a response to that, who wrote The Wizard of Oz, where he believed that fairy tales should be sanitized, that children should not have to read. That children should not read, grisly tales and, things like that. And so then you have this really interesting free speech conversation. And I don't know. That's why I like fairy tales.
Yeah. I same here. I used to, when I was an early adult, I used to collect the original versions or the earliest versions of fairy tales that I could find, specifically for that reason. I found them fascinating because I'd grown up with Disney.
Yeah.
And then to find out that there was so much more depth and nuance and like grittiness to these stories that I had grown up and loved and had no idea. It was just amazing to me, and that branched me off into enjoying Native American fairy tales. And that branched me off into loving short stories. It was like the snowball of me learning how to love being a reader. And there are books that I read way before I was old enough to read them, but I value the fact that I read them. They make me who I am today. And again, because they were dirty and horrible, I actually read. So I probably have Harlequin Romance and Anais Nin to thank for having a college graduate level reading in middle school. And it's a difficult thing to balance.
Yeah.
Since we have a hard stop, should we do the game?
Yes.
Yeah, because we're way off topic and we're just enjoying Michael's company.
I brought it around. I brought it back.
I saw you. You were good. That was
very impressed how you circled back. The only comment I was going to make on The Wizard of Oz is I don't know that his point of view necessarily censors things like the Brothers Grimm. So he's saying it should be sanitized, and then it's up to people who consume art to decide whether or not they agree with him. He's an alternative. So it's a little bit like the battle of ideas.
Yeah, but he was pretty vocal about it, right? And so you have people that fall into camps, and does it lead to censorship, perhaps, right?
Mm-hmm.
Man, Michael, I could talk to you for ages about censorship and art and social commentary. You are just good people to talk to.
Yeah,
got to protect freedom of speech.
Should we rate? Not rate. Rate the story.
Yeah.
1 to 6.
My ear. Oh, my bad hearing. I'm just not even going to say what it sounded like you said. I am going to, I like this story, and talking to Michael, I like it more than I originally set out. It's not as complex as I normally like my fairy tales, but I felt like it was really well drawn. It did what it needed to do. I don't have anything I can really fault this story. And so I feel like it's getting a very well-deserved and solid 5 from me.
Okay. Michael, 1 to 6?
1 to 6. Okay, I was thinking 1 to 10. So it would be a 6 for me.
Okay. So I'm coming in lower at a 4.5. I was coming at a 4, came up half a point. It's just hard for me to get into fairy tales. I don't even have to knock it. I just rate these very personally on my enjoyment level.
And actually, that's pretty high for you, because usually fairy tales and parables.
Yeah. I'm literally 3.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, in any school.
All right. So I was able to make a long conversation, and I was able to bring both of you up above the average in terms of what you usually do with fairy tales.
Mm-hmm. And you circled us back from Cosby to fairy tales like a pro.
Yeah, I'll take that as a win.
So, since we have 6 minutes, so Hans Christian Andersen is the Danish master of literary fairy tales, whatever that means, and he wrote 212 fairy tales. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a well-known fairy tale, and then you're going to tell me if it's Hans Christian Andersen or not, yes or no. And you can get extra points by telling me if it wasn't Hans Christian Andersen, who was it, and where are they from, which country?
All right. I can tell you right now, I'm
Also, a
going to
couple of
embarrass
them
myself.
are unknown. So if you're like unknown, okay, so
Okay.
it could be a wild guess. See what you get. Okay, we'll go with Michael first.
Okay.
Puss in Boots.
Okay, that is not Hans Christian Andersen.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know who it is. Don't know who wrote it. I just think of Shrek, and I know that's not the right answer.
So unknown who exactly, but the oldest telling, like published retelling, is by an Italian author named Giovanni Francesco Straparola, but Charles Perrault wrote the version that we're most familiar with now.
All right.
Okay, Maya, The Little Mermaid.
The Little Mermaid, Hans Christian Andersen.
Yep. Okay, Michael, Thumbelina.
Thumbelina. Yes, Hans Christian Andersen.
Yes. Okay, Maya, The Three Little Pigs.
I want to say Grimm, but it's not. It's somebody else. I'm going to say Grimm because that's all I can think about right now.
It's not Grimm, but it's not Hans Christian Andersen. So you get a point for that because that's the real question. It's unknown, English origins, but
cool.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, Michael, Sleeping Beauty.
Ooh, this is a tough one. I'm going to say not Hans Christian Andersen. I don't know who.
It's not. It's Charles Perrault.
Charles Perrault. Yeah, that's one. I haven't read very much of his stuff. I know his stories, but.
Okay, Maya, The Emperor's New Clothes.
That is Grimm.
Nope, that's Hans Christian Andersen.
Really?
Oh, I didn't know he wrote that. That's exciting.
I didn't know that either.
Random. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, Michael, The Tortoise and the Hare.
Hans Christian Andersen.
Nope, that's Aesop.
Oh, duh. I wasn't thinking.
Aesop Fables.
Yep.
Maya, The Ugly Duckling.
Hans Christian Andersen.
Yep. Michael, Cinderella.
Hans Christian Andersen.
Nope, Charles Perrault again. Maya, The Princess and the Pea.
Brothers Grimm.
Nope, that's Hans Christian Andersen. Michael, The Nutcracker and the Mouse King.
Hans Christian Andersen.
Nope, E.T.A. Hoffman, German. There's so many fairy
Really?
tale authors.
You would think with that title that would have been a Hans Christian Andersen.
Right?
Yeah, totally.
Oh, well.
And Maya, Bambi.
Andersen. No, it's somebody else. It's a third
Someone
party.
else. Mm-hmm. Felix Salten, German. We didn't say what the stories were. So Maya won by 1 point.
In light of his death, we will be reading Defender of the Faith by Philip Roth.
Okay, perfect.
Cool.
Michael, I will submit your story at a future date and fight for it. You emailed it to me, so
she will fight.
I will.
For your right to read Michael's story.
And this one is much longer, and it's much more deep and dark and gritty. You'll love it. Trust me.
Oh, Rami will love it. Yeah. Okay.
Science fiction?
It is literary.
Ooh. I don't know what kind of literary reading you like. This will be interesting. You better fight for it, Anais.
I will fight for it. All right. And it seems like I'm just so noble putting in guest stories that didn't go through readers. They're just doing the work for me, so I don't have to find stories. It's not noble at all. All right. But before you go, tell us how you scored on the fairy tale quiz in the comments section at literaryroadhouse.com or on Twitter at litroadhouse. And although the young couple in this story were not fated to marry, I suspect fate smiles more kindly on us, dear listener. We're fated to read together and discuss full fiction novels on the Literary Roadhouse Book Club. And instead of sailing away out to sea, surf the internet and arrive at our new Facebook group, Literary Roadhouse Readers, where we discuss everything we read on either show and much, much more. Also, this story made us realize that wine bottles have complex internal lives. So we're starting a pasture for old wine bottles to graze and live out their final centuries in peace. Support our wine bottle refuge and our podcast at patreon.com/literary-roadhouse. Every bit helps. And that's where we publish things like author interviews. Go there to watch my interview with Michael LeBron. It's only for our Patreon subscribers for a whole month. And as always, share this podcast with reckless men who throw wine bottles out of hot air balloons. Until next time, read a good story.
Read a good story.